It is little wonder migrant crossings have increased dramatically since the lockdown began, and Home Secretary Priti Patel needs to stop talking tough and sort these issues out, charities say. Miserable conditions in French refugee camps and fears over COVID-19 are making migrants increasingly desperate to reach the UK, it is believed. Refugee camps, migrants. Meanwhile, border force officers are worried about catching coronavirus when dealing with those who make it to Britain. More than 850 migrants have crossed to the UK during lockdown, data gathered by the PA news agency has shown. During periods of calm weather, migrants are piling into inflatable boats, up to 50 per vessel, and making the terrifying and dangerous crossing. See the word use in each and every one of these articles, regardless of which source, which standpoint in the political spectrum you decide to view. It's the same word use. Dangerous crossing, risking their lives, the plight, the harrowing ordeal, etc., etc., piling into inflatable boats, the terrifying journey. It's conditioning, it's repetition, it's propaganda for the most part. And credit to Nigel Farage for one thing, at least he has drawn attention to a subject that barely anybody seems to be aware of at this point, since they've stopped talking about it for the most part in the media. They only ever seem to cover these stories when other people spot them and they feel they're obliged. But he too is joining in on implying that this is all the result of people smugglers. And articles like this, as cancerous as they are, they also play into the same narrative. They come out and they say they give their 2 cents to try and induce this feeling of sympathy, etc., etc., and they go out and they demand safe and legal routes, or the charities do, etc., and they too talk about smugglers, and it's just a back and forth between the two, and it distracts the public from pinning the blame where it should be placed, and that is at the feet of the French and the British government. 2018, this all started. 2018, the migrant and refugee compacts were simultaneously signed. On the quiet, of course. Didn't hear the media talking about them. They kept it quiet. The petition speaks volumes in that regard. Only managed to peak over 100,000. Anyway, I digress. The idea of Abdul and Bamba Flimby and all their brethren from their neighbouring countries all across the African continent and the Asian world and the Muslim world rocking up in Cali, parting with their cash to pay smugglers who then in turn manage to sneak past all the authorities that are supposedly looking for them, hand them a boat for these people to then traverse the English Channel only to be met by our border force and taken the rest of the way here. It makes no sense. What does make sense, however, is the fact that the French wanted to clear Calais for some time, they wanted to clear Dunkirk for some time, and lo and behold, we sign those compacts, courtesy of the United Nations, and lo and behold, here we are. 2 years later, the problem persists. 2 years later, the problem accelerates. 2 years later, the problem is a lot worse than it once was. Anyway, last weekend saw what is believed to be a new single-day record, with 145 migrants making it to the UK on Veterans Day. Comes despite repeated assertions by the Home Office that the pandemic has had no impact on its ability to respond to the crossings. Yeah, they're not kidding, because it was happening before the pandemic, so, so-called pandemic. Minister for Immigration Compliance, Chris Philip, said, "We are working all night and day to dismantle and arrest the criminal gangs who trade in people smuggling." Oh, well, that's why you're still at it, Chris Philip. Because there is no people smugglers. There is no criminal gangs. There is no smuggling operation. So you're pissing in the wind, you're twiddling your thumbs, you're pretending that you're on the case. But the recent increase in crossings is totally unacceptable. There's another thing they do. The "I'm very angry" routine. It's back again. It's totally unacceptable. I'm very angry that you've done this. You don't do anything about it though, do you? And it's sickening that smugglers are willing to put people's lives at risk. I'll get fucked. This is why we are stepping up action to stop the crossings. How many times have we heard the stepping up action routine? It's boring. It's redundant, pal. Going after the criminals perpetrating these heinous crimes. These words, they're so handpicked, so deliberately handpicked. and prosecuting them for their criminal activity. All these words is to give off this impression. It's trying to imply that they agree with the public, that they think it's unacceptable, but for different reasons. They're on the case because they too think it's heinous what's going on. On Monday, Ms Patel said extensive work continues between the UK and French authorities on migrant crossings, but she was criticised by Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage, who said on Tuesday, "Time to stop the French authorities walking all over us." Bella Sankey, Director of Detention Action, said lockdown has inevitably increased the desperation, oh fucking hell, pardon my French, of these fleeing war and persecution. What war are the Africans fleeing? What war are the Iranians fleeing? What war are the majority of these people fleeing? Just slapping assumptions on these people gives credence to them being there in the first place. Do people not comprehend the blatant lies being told here? Priti Patel's tough talk sounds like a broken record on repeat. Her flawed strategy is making a bad situation worse. Now it's time for some stateswomanship and leadership. Stephen Hale, Chief Executive of Refugee Action, well, your job's pretty redundant considering all fucking migrants, said the government needs to stop talking tough and start acting smart. No, they need to start acting tough and create more routes for people to claim protection in the UK. Oh my god. Again with this garbage. Safe, legal, regular, orderly migration. Sustainable Development Goal 10.7. Juncker was the first to quote it, then the Migrant Compact came to fruition, and then that fat guy who's in charge of the UN, Antonio Guterres, with his triple chin, was the third to quote it. And then the charities started to quote it, then the lefties started to quote it. Now we've got Stephen Hale, the latest in a long line, quoting it, or a variation of. This includes long-term commitment to resettle 10,000 refugees every year. How many times are we going to hear this claim or this demand for us to resettle 10,000 a year? Every year. Every year. That's making this... The Syrian war is over, or near enough over, as far as I'm aware. And second of all, this 10,000 a year, there's no cap on that. There's no limit. So this just goes on forever. That's assuming that there's going to be constant wars or constant excuses. More like. Oh, and Claire Mosley's back. Claire Mosley's back. Oh no. Head of humanitarian charity Care for Cali, which provides aid to migrants living in camps around the city, said the lockdown is stretching refugees. Provides aid to migrants living in camps, but she's talking about refugees. It's stretching refugees to breaking point as multiple charities have pulled out of the area and there are food shortages, and even that isn't enough to make them apply for asylum in France. They still sit there and bide their time. She added, "We wasted millions of pounds and risk people's lives trying to intercept boats at sea, when the only way to put a real stop to these crossings is to create safe and legal routes for asylum claims to be fairly hard." Oh, Jesus. Border staff meeting migrants on shore initially were given no personal protective equipment, the Union for Borders, Immigration and Customs Workers said. Well, they now have access to masks, yada yada. Spokeswoman Lucy Morton said it's fairly common for the arrivals to be soaked with bilge water from the small vessel, which includes fuel, oil and human waste, including vomit and urine. It's not so, and that's our problem, because what? Again, it is very difficult to be fully protected in those circumstances, and staff are concerned about the transmission of other diseases as well as COVID-19. Why are these people not even being tested for this so-called deadly virus? Why are these people being taken here in the midst of a so-called pandemic and then given the green light to live their life in the UK for the most part? Never tested for COVID-19, no. Why's that? Crews on ships have access to PPE, but it's not practical, or indeed safe to have full PPE similar to a clinical setting because of the physical demands of the role. The Home Office said, in line with Public Health England guidance, Border Force and all operational staff have the relevant personal protective equipment available to them. Oh, that's great. And we have another one here regarding asylum seekers in Scotland who are forced into shared accommodation despite lockdown. And the charity also demands answers after the death of a Syrian refugee. Now, ordinarily, anybody that's found dead in a hotel room or a guest hotel room, the automatic assumption wouldn't be that they died due to ill treatment from the staff in said hotel or guest hotel room. But oh no, we have, what's her name? Sorry. Rabina Qureshi, who happens to have a different opinion in that regard. She, of course, is a Pakistani-born human rights campaigner. Yeah. She's a notable critic of the UK's asylum policies and has campaigned to stop inhumane treatment and close detention centres for asylum seekers. Of course she is. Her parents came to Glasgow as immigrants in the 1960s, etc, etc. She's come out with some doozies in the past to, positive action in housing, which is this. Sorry. We're an independent, anti-racist, homeless and human rights charity dedicated to supporting refugees and migrants rebuild their lives. Anti-racist, so she's anti-white. She's essentially a communist, whether or not she realises. Another one she came out with, which I find just unbearably... Liam Neeson's affair highlights the racism in our society. Oh my god. Rabina Qureshi says Liam Neeson's remarks have lifted the lid on the sewer of racism in the UK, coming from the Boot, who's an anti-racist campaigner, a so-called human rights campaigner who spews out venom in Scotland while her own country treats women like shit. That's the sort of woman we're dealing with here. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, it says here, refugee housing charity Positive Action in Housing says Muse Group's actions have significantly increased the risk of coronavirus and mental health problems among some of the country's most vulnerable people and are calling on the Home Office to explain why the relocations were allowed to take place. In her letter to Home Secretary Priti Patel, Rabina Qureshi writes, since March 2020 the country's been in the midst of a global pandemic and lockdown. Millions of us went into self-isolation and non-essential travel was forbidden, but essential travel's fine. That somehow makes you exempt from catching it. Last month, the Muse Group and or its subcontractors moved around 400 vulnerable men, women and children. Vulnerable, why? Because they assume they're vulnerable. They assume that these people, regardless of if we're talking about Calais, Dunkirk, the boat crossers, or these people, they're all assumed to be vulnerable. They're all assumed to be fleeing perils of wherever they came from. They're all assumed to be fleeing X, Y, and Z, hence their asylum application. Just because somebody applies for asylum, that does not automatically mean that their reasoning for applying for said application is valid, for lack of a better term. Just because somebody claims asylum, that does not mean that their reasoning for doing so is valid. And on top of that, laxing the rules on these people, these anti-racist groups and these twats like Claire Mosley, etc, the list goes on, making it easier, begging, pleading, pressurising, etc, encourages and incentivises people more and more to come over here and repeat what people that came before them did. Anyway, last month, Mears should act with complete disregard. It's beyond comprehension that Mears should act with complete disregard for public health by moving hundreds of vulnerable people, many of whom are survivors of trauma or torture. Many of whom, so not all, but second of all, how do you know that they're fleeing trauma or torture? How do you know that they've experienced trauma or torture? What part of Africa are they fleeing from to experience the harrowing plight of war, trauma and torture? It's not Syria, that's for sure. Anyway, for the stability of their self-contained flats into empty and presumably dirty cheap hotels, presumably, so you don't know, you're just assuming that they're dirty, where it's impossible to socially distance or self-isolate. Reports from asylum seekers describe how they were only given minutes to pack before hurried into vans 4 or 5 at a time. Well, of course they are going to say what you want to hear. Whenever you see these clips of these people talking about how bad things are, when the Sky News journalists are interviewing them in Calais or wherever it is, or take this for example, you're not telling me that these people are not playing up to the camera because they know one of two things. The arseholes that are interviewing them, or the arseholes that these refugees, quote unquote, or asylum seekers gave this information to, believe everything they say, or two, they know that they might not believe it, but they're willing to exploit it anyway. Anyway, Miss Qureshi, what a shock you're a miss, goes on to explain the realities of life for those people in the hotels. Bedding and towels are changed only once a week. People cannot open windows to their rooms. They want to clean their own space, cook their own food, and have some control over their environment. Crucially, levels of depression are increasing and people are being left completely isolated. Many asylum seekers are survivors of trauma and torture and suffering mental health problems because of the length of time they have been in the asylum system. The hotel asylum seekers are isolated in their rooms, unable to cook or wash laundry. Many are too terrified to come out, even for exercise, because of the virus. And whose fault's that? Mainstream media and the government. PAIH is now demanding that the Home Office explains why lockdown restrictions were seemingly ignored during the relocations and to immediately reinstate asylum seekers' personal allowances. Personal allowances. Ridiculous. The charity is also calling for urgent investigation into the circumstances around Mr. Obel's death and the allegations that Mears Group flouted lockdown regulations during the relocation process. Our greatest fear is that there are many people like Adnan currently residing in their hotels without money or proper support. There are many other Adnans living in these hotels. This would go some way to ease the hardship they are currently suffering. A Home Office spokesperson said, "We are aware of an incident resulting in an individual sadly losing his life, but it would be inappropriate to comment before all the facts have been established." Don't let that stop you, Ms. Qureshi. We're only moving asylum seekers where it is necessary, strictly following guidance from public health authorities and into accommodation that allows for social distancing. There has been no changes to when cash allowances are provided to asylum seekers. A Mears spokesperson said once COVID-19 restrictions were announced by the government, Mears considered her best to house asylum seekers in Glasgow who were at initial accommodation stage. Our goal has always been to ensure the safety of asylum seekers in our care. By placing asylum seekers in Glasgow in good quality hotel accommodation, we believe we can ensure a safer environment and provide people with food and other essential items directly. By providing all meals directly, this avoids the need for food banks or trips to buy food, greatly reducing the risk of exposure. It is Home Office policy that where a fully catered and supported service is provided, including all toiletries and requirements, this replaces the personal cash allowance. Handling coins and banknotes has thought to spread COVID-19, and Mears believed that by switching to a fully catered service, this will reduce the likelihood of asylum seekers becoming infected in this way. That should be the end of the discussion. Because they do this all the time. They complain about their so-called measly little allowance they get, but what they don't tell you is that they're housed. They get everything handed to them. But that don't let that stop you, Miss Qureshi. Now you go on your anti-racist power trip.